This lecture is going to be about traversing the DOM. So DOM traversing is basically walking through the DOM, which means that we can select an element based on another element. And this is very important because sometimes we need to select elements relative to a certain other element. For example, a direct child or a direct parent element. Or sometimes we don't even know the structure of the DOM at runtime. And in all these cases, we need DOM traversing. And this video is going to be another very nice reference lecture for you. And so let's now work with this H1 element here. And from here, we're going to go downwards, upwards, and also sideways. So let's quickly inspect this element. All right. So we see, so here we have the H1 element, and in there we have some text, we have some comments, then we have this span element, then some more text, and even more elements. And so this is going to be a lot of fun exploring a couple of different methods and properties to walk around this element. So let's start by selecting it. Maybe we already did that before somewhere, but that doesn't really matter. So let's start with going downwards. So basically selecting child elements. So the first way of doing that is to use query selector, because we already know that query selector also works on elements, not only on the document. So let's simply log to the console h1.querySelector, and then let's again see here what we could select. So we have this class highlight and this class highlight. So that's these two green ones. And so let's select them here. So that's actually query selector all, because there are two of them. And so class highlight. So let's take a look. And indeed, here they are. So this here indeed selects all the elements with the highlight class that are children of the H1 element. And that would work no matter how deep these child elements would be inside of the H1 element. Okay, and that's very important to notice. All right. Now in this case, these two elements here are direct children of the H1, but as I said, it would go down as deep as necessary into the DOM tree. Okay? And also, if there were other highlight elements on the page, so elements with this class, they would not get selected, because they would not be children of the H1 element. All right? So these are 2 points that are important to note here about query selector and query selector all. Now, sometimes all we need are actually direct children. And so for that, we can use h1.childNodes. So let's take a look. And so here we actually get all kinds of stuff. So we get text, we get a comment, and we get then these elements. And that's because we already know that nodes can be anything. So they can be text or elements or even comments, as we have here. Okay? So this really gives us every single node of every single type that there exists. But many times we are simply interested in the elements themselves, right? So if we wanted the text, we could use .textContent or .innerHTML. So child nodes is not that used, but instead we can use children, just like this. And this then gives us an HTML collection, which remembers is a live collection, so it's updated. And so here we indeed only get the 3 elements that are actually inside of the H1. So that's this span, this breaking, and this span again. All right, but this one works only for direct children, so keep that in mind. Okay. Finally, there's also first and last element child. So these names are a little bit confusing, but one more time, that's because of the messy nature of JavaScript, with all of these things being implemented at different points in time, and so therefore it was difficult to keep consistent naming conventions. But anyway, let's use first element child, and so here it already is, style.color, just so that I can show you that we can actually also set these properties, or use them to set something like the style. So for example, we can do this, and then only the first child here gets now this color set to white. So basically that's this element here, which is the first element here of all the children. That's why it's called first element child. And we can of course do also last element child, and let's say this one to black. So it's a little bit different now. It used to be, let's say, orange red. I really like this one. And so now it looks a little bit more crazy. Okay, but now let's go upwards. So going upwards, so basically selecting parents. And for direct parents, it's actually very straightforward. So here we have h1.parent node. And so that one is similar to child nodes. So let's see. And so it's this header title. So as we open this up, we see that indeed this h1 here is inside of header title. And so this is the direct parent. And so that's why we get this. Then there's also the parent element, which is usually the one that we are interested in. But in this case, it's simply the same. All right, because this element is also a node in this case. All right. However, most of the time, we actually need a parent element which is not a direct parent. Or in other words, we might need to find a parent element no matter how far away it is in the DOM tree. And for that, we have the closest method. So that's h1.closest. So let's say that on the page we had multiple headers, so multiple elements with the class of header. But for some reason, we only wanted to find the one that is a parent element of h1, so of our h1 element here. And so for that, we can use closest. And so the closest method receives a query string just like query selector and query selector all. All right. So .header, and then let's do something with it. For example, change the background image, or just change the background. And I will set it here now actually to a CSS variable. So let me show that to you. So here we have all of these CSS variables, or as they are officially called, custom properties. And we use them in CSS by doing this. So by writing variable and then a color. And so, well, let's actually use a gradient. So gradient, yeah, so this one. Okay. Just so you can see that we can use custom properties also in CSS. So give it a save. And beautiful. Well, it's not that beautiful, I must say, but indeed it worked. So it selected the closest header to our h1 element, so the closest parent element that has this class, and then it simply applied our style to that element. So this is a very important one, and we're going to use it all the time, especially for event delegation. So take a note of that, or just keep it in mind. Now, if this selector here actually matches the element on which we're calling closest, then that's actually the element that's going to be returned. So let me also show that. So we are calling this on the h1 element. And so if we're looking for the closest h1, then that's going to be exactly the element itself. And so, as I just said, then that's going to be the one that will be returned. Let's make this a bit more prominent here. And so you see that indeed, Now this is the h1 element itself. So we can think of closest here as basically being the opposite of query selector. So both receive a query string as an input, but query selector finds children no matter how deep in the DOM tree, while the closest method finds parents, and also no matter how far up in the DOM tree. All right. So very important method here to keep in mind. And now let's go sideways. So selecting siblings. And for some reason in JavaScript, we can only access direct siblings. So basically only the previous and the next one. So that's h1.previous element sibling, like this. And then there's also the next element sibling. All right. So the previous element sibling is null. And so if we take a look at that, it makes sense because there is nothing there. So this is the first child of this parent element, and therefore it doesn't have a previous sibling, but it has a next sibling. And so that's this h4 element, which comes after it. And just like before, we also have the same methods, or actually the same properties for nodes. So that's just previous sibling and next sibling. So let's see. And here the previous sibling is now actually text. So not sure what that is. Well, it's not really important because again, most of the time we're going to be working with the elements anyway. Now, if we really need all the siblings and not just the previous and the next one, then we can use the trick of moving up to the parent element and then read all the children from there. So let's see. So h1 dot parent element. So that's just like we learned before. So the direct parent, and then from there we can get all the children. So just like we learned here also before. So dot children. And so now we get all of the siblings. And that of course is going to include itself. So that's all of these elements, and all of them are siblings. And just for fun, let's actually do something with them here. So this is an HTML collection, remember, so it's one more time not an array, but it is still an iterable that we can spread into an array. So we can do this, and it will then create an array from this. And then we can loop over that array and do something using the for each method. So let's say that we wanted to change some style to all the siblings, but except the element itself. And actually that's more straightforward than you might imagine. So we can simply do this here. So we can check if the element is different or equal also works than the h1. Because h1 is our original element itself. And so comparisons between elements actually work just fine. Okay? And so when the element is not the h1 itself, then let's change the style. And let's say we want the transform property just to scale them a little bit. Let's say 0.5. So scaling them by 50%. And indeed, all the other three siblings are now like 50% smaller. All right. And so this is how we can work with all the sibling elements of one element. Great. And that's actually the fundamentals of DOM traversing. And we're going to need them all the time, and especially when we're doing some more complex event delegation like we will do throughout the rest of this section.